From the archives of the Vance family, a collection of private correspondences reveals a story not of a grand public courtship, but of a love nurtured in silence, one that finally broke its quiet vow to prevent a spirit from being extinguished. It began, as so many tragedies do, with the rustle of silk and the cold weight of a promise made of coin, not affection. Eleanora Vance existed in a world of muted greys and soft, apologetic beiges. Her life was a carefully embroidered sampler of duty and obedience, stretched taut within the gilded frame of her engagement to Viscount Julian Finch. It was a respectable match, society whispered, a practical union between her modest but unencumbered dowry and his ancient but heavily mortgaged title. Yet, within the walls of Finch House, where she resided under the watchful eye of her future mother-in-law, Lady Beatrice Finch, Eleanora was less a future viscountess and more a piece of furniture, useful, unobtrusive, and utterly silent. Her intelligence was a thing to be kept folded away like fine linen, brought out only for the household accounts, while her quiet resilience was mistaken for meekness. Her days were measured by the chiming of the long case clock in the hall, each tick a reminder of the life slowly draining away from her. She found her only solace in the forgotten glass house at the edge of the gardens, a cathedral of dusty panes and determined, sprawling ivy. There, among the sleeping orchids and ferns, she could breathe. She read books on botany and classification, her mind finding a fierce, clean joy in the logic of the natural world, a stark contrast to the shifting, treacherous currents of the drawing-room. Her virtues were of the soil and the page, unseen and unvalued by the very people who were meant to cherish her. Viscount Finch was a man sculpted from polished mediocrity. He was handsome in the way a department store mannequin is handsome, all perfect angles, and an unnerving lack of inner life. His affections were reserved for his reflection in the mirror and the clink of gold in his purse. To him, Eleanora was a transaction, a necessary inconvenience on the path to solvency. He spoke to her in platitudes, his eyes glazing over when she dared to offer an opinion, his compliments as thin and brittle as spun sugar. His cruelty was not the grand, theatrical villainy of novels. It was a quieter, more insidious erosion, a daily campaign of polite disregard that left her feeling like a ghost in her own life. His mother, Lady Beatrice, was the true architect of Eleanora's gilded cage, a woman whose spine seemed forged from glacial ice. She wielded social standing like a finely honed blade. Her smiles never reached her cold, calculating eyes, and her every word was a stone, placed carefully in the wall, being built around Eleanora's spirit. She corrected Eleanora's posture, critiqued her simple gowns, and made it abundantly clear that her presence was tolerated, not welcomed. She was the gatekeeper to a world. Eleanora had no desire to enter, yet was forced to inhabit. The impending event that hung over the season, like a Damoclean sword, was the annual Blackwood Ball. It was to be hosted by the Duke of Blackwood, Alaric St. Vincent, a man who was more myth than peer. The Iron Duke, they called him, a phantom who haunted his own magnificent estate, a recluse, shrouded in rumours of a tragic past and an unapproachable severity. For the Finches, an invitation was the culmination of a year's strategic manoeuvring. For Julian, it was a stage upon which he could parade his beautiful vapid fiancée. For Lady Beatrice, it was the ultimate validation of her social supremacy. For Eleanora, it was simply another performance. She knew her role, to be a silent, agreeable accessory, to smile when prompted, and to fade into the damask wallpaper when not required. She felt a familiar weariness settle deep in her bones, the heavy cloak of resignation she had worn for so long. She did not know that this ball, this glittering apex of the London season, was not to be an ending, but a shattering. A breaking point from which something new and formidable would finally be allowed to grow in the ruins. She did not know that the phantom of Blackwood Manor had been watching her for years, not as a ghost, but as a guardian. The night of the Blackwood ball arrived on a current of damp, chilled air, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Eleonora stood before the cheval glass in her room, a stranger in dove-grey silk. The gown was an exercise in tasteful restraint, chosen by Lady Beatrice to ensure she did not outshine the more vibrant peacocks of the ton. It was elegant, impeccably made, but it was a uniform of invisibility. Agnes, her loyal maid, and the only soul in the house who saw the flicker of fire behind Eleonora's quiet eyes, finished arranging a simple silver comb in her dark hair. "You look a vision, Miss Eleonora," Agnes whispered, her voice a small pocket of warmth in the cold room. Eleonora offered a faint smile in the reflection. A fleeting, tired Jess. S's. It felt like preparing for a sacrifice. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a kingdom, carved from pale stone and darkness. Its windows blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, casting long skeletal shadows across the sprawling grounds. Inside, the ballroom was a maelstrom of sound and colour, a sea of jewels, satin, and forced laughter. The air was thick with perfume and ambition. Chandeliers, like captured constellations, dripped crystal light onto the swirling dancers below. Eleonora felt the familiar sensation of being erased, her quiet presence utterly consumed by the magnificent, overwhelming spectacle. Julian, preening in his perfectly tailored evening wear, led her through the crush with a proprietary hand on her elbow, nodding to acquaintances and basking in the reflected glory of the Duke's domain. After one obligatory stilted dance, Julian abandoned her by a pillar with a murmured excuse about securing champagne. Lady Beatrice was already holding court, her sharp laughter cutting through the orchestral swell. Eleonora was left alone, an island in the glittering tide. She endured the polite nods and the gazes that slid past her, seeing only the fiancé of a viscount, a placeholder in a social equation. The weight of it all pressed down on her. The noise, the heat, the suffocating pretense. She needed air. She needed silence. She found her escape through a set of tall glass doors leading to a vast, domed conservatory. The change in atmosphere was immediate and profound. The humid air was redolent with the scent of damp soil, night-blooming jasmine, and something else, something exotic and spicy. Moonlight filtered through the glass roof, silvering the leaves of enormous ferns and casting intricate shadows on the mosaic floor. It was a jungle of shadows and whispers, a world away from the ballroom's glare. Here, among the silent, growing things, she felt her own soul unfurl. She traced the velvety petal of a rare black orchid, a flower as dark and mysterious as the house's master. It was then that she heard their voices, sharp and clear in the relative quiet of the glass house. Julian and his mother had followed her in, seeking a moment of privacy for their own cruelties. They had not seen her, hidden as she was behind a wall of cascading ivy. She is simply intolerable tonight. Lady Beatrice hissed, her voice a silken blade. So plain, so utterly devoid of sparkle. Did you see how she stood there? Like a frightened mouse. We must conclude the business with the Covington girl soon. Her father's shipping fortune would secure us for generations. Eleonora froze, her hand hovering over the orchid. A piece of ice seemed to lodge itself in her chest. Julian's reply was a languid, dismissive drawl. "Patience, mother. Miss Covington is playing coy. As for Eleonora, her dowry will serve its purpose. It will cover the most pressing of the debts. Once we have the Covington contract signed, we can find a way to dissolve the engagement. A convenient illness, perhaps, a sudden desire for a quiet country life on her part. She is so malleable, she will believe whatever we tell her." "Malleable?" Lady Beatrice scoffed. "She is a stone, a dull grey stone, but a useful one for now. Just ensure she remains ignorant. The last thing we need is a scene from the Little Martyr. They spoke of her as if she were a line item in a ledger, a beast of burden to be used and then put out to pasture. Every word was a hammer blow against the fragile shield she had built around her heart. It was not the betrayal that wounded her most deeply. She had never harboured any illusions about their affection. It was the casual, brutal contempt. The complete and utter dismissal of her as a person. The last, stubborn ember of hope she had unknowingly harboured that perhaps, with time, she could earn a sliver of respect, of human decency, was extinguished. A vast, cold emptiness opened within her. She did not weep. The capacity for tears seemed to have frozen inside her. With a stillness that felt ancient and profound, she stepped from behind the ivy. Her face was a pale, composed mask, her eyes dark and fathomless. Julian and Lady Beatrice started, their expressions shifting from conspiratorial malice to theatrical shock, and then to irritation. Eleonora said nothing. She simply looked at them, a long, level gaze that held a universe of unspoken contempt. She saw them for what they were, small, grasping, hollow people. The power they held over her was an illusion. She had helped to maintain through her own silence. She would be silent no longer, but her defiance would not be a shrill, hysterical scene. It would be a quiet, dignified exit. She turned her back on them, the rustle of her silk gown, the only sound in the sudden taut silence, and walked away. Not back to the ballroom, but towards a side door that led out into the cold, dark gardens. She walked away from the engagement, from the Finches, from the life that was slowly suffocating her. Her regal composure was a suit of armour, forged in the fires of their cruelty. And from the deepest shadows of the conservatory, where he had been tending to his prized orchids, the Iron Duke watched her go, his fists clenched at his sides, a storm gathering in his glacial blue eyes. He had seen it all. Duke Alaric of Blackwood was a man who preferred the company of ghosts and shadows. For 5 years, since the death of his first wife Isabella, he had cultivated his reputation as a recluse, with the same meticulous care he gave to his rare botanical specimens. He moved through his own home like a phantom, a formidable presence felt but rarely seen. Society saw him as a figure of immense power and chilling severity, a man carved from the same granite as his ancestral home. They did not see the grief that had settled into a permanent winter in his soul, or the profound weariness he felt for the brittle, grasping world his title forced him to inhabit. He had been in his conservatory, the only room in the sprawling manor that felt truly his, when the Finches had entered with their venom. He had remained in the deep shadows behind a towering bird of paradise plant, a silent, unwilling audience to their casual assassination of a woman's spirit. He had been watching Eleanora Vance for years. He had first noticed her in a bustling London bookshop, her head bent over a dusty tome on horticulture, her expression one of serene, intellectual focus, a stark contrast to the giggling débutantes flitting through the aisles. He saw her at dreary society functions, a quiet island of dignity in a sea of artifice. He saw the way she carried herself, the subtle strength in her posture, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He had quietly admired her resilience, her ability to withstand the slow, grinding cruelty of the Finches with a grace that was nothing short of breathtaking. To him, she was not plain. She was refined, like a piece of sea glass, her edges smoothed by a harsh tide, but her inner light undiminished. He had witnessed the entire sordid exchange. He had felt a white-hot rage, a protective instinct so fierce it startled him. As he listened to Julian Finch discard her like a worn-out glove, he saw her step from the shadows, her face pale but her spine ramrod straight. He saw the magnificent, silent contempt in her eyes as she turned her back on them. It was not the act of a victim. It was the act of a queen. And in that moment, the quiet admiration he had harboured for her, for years, coalesced into something far more potent, something sharp and dangerously real. He watched her walk out into the unforgiving night, her thin silk gown no match for the biting wind that swept across the moors. He saw her falter near the old stone balustrade overlooking the dark, churning lake. He saw her shoulders slump, the iron composure finally cracking under the immense weight of her heartbreak. She wrapped her arms around herself, a fragile silhouette against the vast, indifferent darkness. And then he heard it, a whisper carried on the wind, so faint he almost missed it, a sound that broke the icy dam around his own heart. "I have given up." That whisper of utter despair was a call to arms. It was the snapping of a tether he did not know he had been holding. He would not allow it. He would not allow that light to be extinguished by the petty darkness of lesser men. He materialized from the shadows of the terrace, his footsteps silent on the flagstones. Eleonora gasped, startled, turning to face him. Her eyes were wide in the moonlight, shimmering with unshed tears, but she did not cry. He saw the shock, the vulnerability, and beneath it that core of unyielding steel. He did not offer empty platitudes or suffocating pity. He acted. With a swift, economic movement, he shrugged off his own heavy-wool greatcoat, the one that smelled of leather and winter air, and draped it over her shivering shoulders. The warmth and weight of it were immediate, a solid, tangible shield against the cold and the world. "You will not walk," he commanded, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. It was not a suggestion, it was a statement of fact. "My carriage will see you home, Miss Vance." He offered his arm. For a moment she hesitated, her gaze searching his, looking for the trap, for the pity she so loathed. She found none. In his severe, unreadable expression, she saw only an implacable resolve. With a slow, deliberate nod, she placed her trembling hand on his arm. The fabric of his coat was fine, strong wool, and beneath it, his arm was like granite. It was the first time in years she had felt truly anchored. The journey in his carriage was a study in charged silence. The compartment was dark, lined with plush, black leather, the only light coming from the swaying carriage lamps outside. The rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves on the gravel drive was a soothing, hypnotic sound. The Duke did not speak, but his presence filled the space. He sat opposite her, a formidable silhouette in the gloom. After a few moments he leaned down and retrieved a heated brick wrapped in flannel from a small compartment, placing it gently at her feet. The simple, practical gesture of care was more eloquent than any speech. It was an acknowledgement of her suffering without the humiliation of discussing it. It was an act of profound unspoken kindness that chipped away at the wall of ice forming around her heart. Eleonora clutched the heavy greatcoat around her, its lingering warmth a comfort. She had expected him to take her back to the Vances' modest townhouse, to the inevitable questions and her family's gentle, worried disapproval of any disruption to her advantageous match. Instead, the carriage turned off the main road, passing through a set of imposing iron gates she did not recognize. They swept up a long drive flanked by ancient oaks, coming to a halt before a charming, ivy-covered dower house, set well away from the main manor. A single warm light glowed in a downstairs window. "The hour is too late to disturb your family," the Duke stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will be safe here. You need rest." He opened the carriage door himself, stepping out into the night. "My housekeeper is waiting." "I have also taken the liberty of summoning your maid." Before she could process this, the door to the dower house opened, and Agnes rushed out, her face a mask of concern that melted into relief upon seeing Eleonora safe. Behind her stood a tall, severe-looking woman in a black bombazine dress, Mistress Albright, the Duke's formidable housekeeper. Eleonora allowed herself to be led inside into a cosy parlour where a fire crackled merrily in the hearth. The Duke did not follow, he simply gave a curt nod from the doorway and was gone. Swallowed by the night, the sanctuary had been provided. The next few days passed in a strange, peaceful haze. Eleonora was shielded from the world, from the inevitable fallout with the Finches. No letters were delivered, no callers permitted. Mistress Albright ran the dower house with quiet, formidable efficiency, and Agnes fussed over her, plying her with tea and broth, her presence a constant, comforting balm. For the first time in years, Eleonora was not required to be anything for anyone. She could simply be. She slept, she read, and she slowly began to feel the frayed edges of her soul knitting back together. The Duke did not intrude, yet his presence was a constant protective mantle over the small house. He sent things, a stack of books from his personal library, including a rare, illustrated text on Amazonian orchids that made her gasp with delight, a basket of hothouse peaches, their scent filling the small parlour with the sweet promise of summer, a freshly cut bouquet of the very same black orchids she had admired in the conservatory. These were not the ostentatious gifts of a suitor, but the thoughtful offerings of a kindred spirit. They were acts of quiet care, each one a message, I see you, I understand you. On the third evening he came himself. He was announced by Mistress Albright, and he entered the parlour not as a duke, but as a simple visitor. He did not speak of the ball of the Finches, or of her distress. Instead he gestured to the botany book open on the table beside her. The Cattleya walkeriana, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. A difficult species to cultivate in this climate. You have an interest in such things. It was a statement, not a question. And so they talked. For hours they spoke of root systems and hybridization, of the ruthless logic of the natural world. He listened, truly listened to her thoughts, his intelligent eyes fixed on hers. He treated her not as a damsel to be rescued, but as an intellectual equal. In his company she felt the parts of herself she had been forced to suppress for so long begin to stir and awaken. She found herself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that felt like a foreign country. Later, as the fire burned low, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was then that his emotional guard finally, irrevocably, dropped. He stared into the flames, his handsome, severe face etched with a profound sorrow. My wife, Isabella, she loved society, he began, his voice a low murmur. She thrived on the glitter and the noise. She called this place, he gestured vaguely towards the window, indicating the great manor beyond, her beautiful prison. She found my love for solitude, for silence. A personal failing. An affront, he paused, taking a slow breath. She died in that room, he said, his voice raw with a grief that was still painfully fresh, even after 5 years, trying to give me an heir. The last thing she said to me was that she was sorry she could not give me a son who might one day drag me back into the world. The confession hung in the air, a secret unveiled, a wound exposed to the firelight. He had sealed himself away, not just in grief, but in guilt, convinced that his own nature had somehow contributed to her unhappiness and demise. He turned to look at her, then his gaze intense, stripping away all artifice. For 5 years I have lived in a self-imposed winter. I watched the world from a distance, and I saw nothing but avarice and superficiality. And then I saw you. In bookshops, in parks, enduring the company of those people, he did not need to say their name. I saw your strength. I saw the quiet dignity with which you suffered their pettiness. I admired you from afar, Miss Vance. More than I can say. When I heard you in the garden, when I heard you whisper that you had given up Clear's throat, it felt as though the last point of light in a very dark world was about to be extinguished. I could not permit it. It was a confession of years of silent observation, of a deep, abiding respect that had grown into something more. It was the key to understanding the phantom of Blackwood Manor. He was not just a protector, he was a devotee, and his devotion was about to be tested. The point of no return arrived on the 5th day, in the form of Viscount Julian Finch's travelling chaise, which thundered up the drive to the Dower House in a spray of gravel and righteous indignation. He had spent days fuming, his vanity wounded, and his plans thrown into disarray by Eleanor's audacious disappearance. Egged on by his furious mother, he had come to reclaim his property. He stormed into the parlour without being announced, his face flushed with anger. "Eleonora, what is the meaning of this? Hiding away in the Duke's cottage like some common actress, you will return with me at once. You have caused a scandal. Our engagement—" "There is no engagement," the voice came from the doorway. Duke Alaric stood there, seeming to fill the entire frame. He was impeccably dressed, but there was a cold, lethal stillness about him, the coiled energy of a predator. He moved into the room with a fluid grace that was utterly menacing. Julian, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step back. "This is a private matter between my fiancé and myself, Blackwood." Julian sneered, attempting to regain his footing. "It does not concern you." Alaric gave a smile that was devoid of all warmth. It was a terrifying sight. "On the contrary, Finch, it concerns me a great deal. You see, I have spent the last 3 days becoming intimately acquainted with your family's affairs. A fascinating study in mismanagement and desperation." He moved to the mantelpiece and picked up a thick folio of documents tied with a black ribbon. He held it out. "This is a list of your father's gambling debts held by Mr. Henderson, or rather formally held by him. I purchased them yesterday morning. This," he tapped a second sheaf of papers, "is the mortgage on Finch House itself, which I acquired from the bank 2 days ago. And this last one, this is the deed to your pathetic, crumbling country estate, Oakendale, which I secured from your primary creditor this very afternoon in exchange for forgiving a rather substantial loan." He let the papers drop onto the table with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Julian stared at the documents, his face draining of all colour, his jaw slack with disbelief. Alaric's voice dropped to a glacial whisper. "Your family is ruined, Finch. Utterly and completely. Every penny you thought you possessed, every acre you thought you owned, now belongs to me. You exist from this moment forward only by my sufferance." The Duke's full power, so long held in reserve, was now unleashed. He had not merely shielded Eleanora, he had systematically, ruthlessly, and silently dismantled her enemies. He had bought their ruin. "You will not speak to her again," Alaric continued, his voice a silken threat. "You will not look at her again. You will leave these grounds now, and you will crawl back to whatever hovel your mother can find for you. Is that understood?" Julian could only nod, his bravado utterly shattered. He looked from the Duke's merciless face to Eleanor's calm, steady one. He saw no pity there, only a quiet, final judgment. He stumbled from the room, a broken man, the sound of his carriage retreating a pathetic, frantic clatter. When he was gone, a profound silence filled the room. Alaric turned to Eleanora. The cold fury vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded vulnerability. He crossed the room and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Eleanora," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. This was not merely an act of protection, nor was it an act of revenge. It was an act of devotion. "I cannot offer you a heart that is whole and untested. It is a scarred thing, but it is yours, if you will have it. I am asking you to marry me, not to save you from them, but to save me from the silence, to be my partner, my equal, my Duchess." The proposal was not a rescue, it was a plea, an offering of a shared future, built not on social standing or financial gain, but on mutual respect and a profound, quiet understanding. Tears finally welled in Eleanor's eyes. not of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming it was painful. She had been seen. She had been valued. She was home. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Alaric. The public reckoning was staged with the precision of a military campaign. The venue was a charity auction at the home of the Dowager Countess of Pembroke, a bastion of unimpeachable social standing. The Finches, desperate to quell the vicious rumours circulating about their sudden financial troubles and Eleanora's disappearance, were in attendance. Lady Beatrice held her head high, her face a mask of haughty denial, while Julian lurked in her shadow, his complexion sallow, his eyes darting about nervously. They were attempting to bluff their way through their own execution. The collective gasp that rippled through the grand salon when the Duke of Blackwood was announced was nothing compared to the shockwave that followed when they saw who was on his arm. It was Eleanora. But it was an Eleanora they had never seen before. Gone was the mousy girl in shades of grey. In her place stood a queen. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, a colour that made her dark hair seem like polished jet, and her eyes blaze with an inner fire. A simple but magnificent necklace of diamonds, the Blackwood diamonds, graced her throat. She did not cling to the Duke's arm. She stood beside him, her posture radiating a calm, unassailable confidence. She was his equal, and everyone in the room knew it. The auction proceeded, but the air was thick with tension and whispered speculation. The climax arrived when the auctioneer, a man clearly uncomfortable with his task, cleared his throat and announced the final, unscheduled item of the evening. For the benefit of the fund, we now offer for immediate sale the country estate known as Oakendale, the ancestral seat of the Finch family, to be sold to cover outstanding financial obligations. A deathly hush fell over the room. Julian and Lady Beatrice went rigid, their faces turning ashen. It was a public guillotining, a social execution of the highest order. All eyes turned to them, a mixture of pity, scorn, and morbid fascination. Before the auctioneer could ask for an opening bid, Duke Alaric raised a single imperious finger. His voice, calm and carrying, sliced through the silence. There is no need for an auction. The estate has already been sold. A confused murmur went through the crowd. I purchased it myself several days ago. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. Then he turned his gaze directly on Lady Beatrice. I also take this opportunity to announce my engagement to Miss Eleanora Vance. The room erupted. The ruin was now manifest, the victory complete. Julian pushed past the brink of reason by this final public humiliation, lunged forward, breaking free from his mother's restraining hand. He stopped before Eleanora, his face contorted in a desperate, pathetic sneer. "You cannot do this. We have a contract, an agreement." Eleanora did not flinch. She did not hide behind Alaric. She met Julian's wild gaze with a look of cool, profound serenity. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. It was the voice she had found in the quiet of the Dower House, the voice of a woman who knew her own worth. "There is no contract, Julian," she said, her words quiet but devastatingly articulate. "There was only your greed and my silence. You have the one, and I have found my voice." It was the final, fatal blow. With that simple, powerful declaration, she severed the last tie to her old life. She claimed her victory not with shouting or tears, but with the quiet, unshakable truth. Julian stared at her, defeated, the fight draining out of him, leaving only a hollow, pathetic shell. He was finished, and she was just beginning. Back in the hushed sanctuary of the Blackwood Manor Library, away from the prying eyes and shocked whispers of the ton, the tension of the evening finally broke. The room was a cocoon of warmth and silence, smelling of old leather, beeswax, and the faint, clean scent of the rain that had begun to fall outside. Alaric and Eleonora stood by the great stone fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. The public performance was over. Only the private truth remained. Alaric reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin as if to reassure himself she was real. His glacial composure had melted away, revealing the raw emotion beneath. "I have loved you in silence for years, Eleonora," he confessed, his voice thick with a feeling he had long suppressed. "I watched you from a distance, and you became the anchor in my world of shadows. That night in the garden, when I heard you say you had given up, my own world tilted on its axis. The thought of your light being extinguished was more than I could bear. It was the end of my silence." It had to be. The sealing of their bond was not a polite, chaste kiss. When he lowered his head to hers, it was with all the pent-up longing and fierce protectiveness of those silent years. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of desperate relief, and of a deep, soul-shaking love. It was the start of their real relationship, a promise sealed not before society, but before the hearth of their shared home. It was the merging of two solitudes into a powerful, unbreakable union. They married quietly, a week later, with only Agnes and a stoically approving Mistress Albright as witnesses. They retreated to Blackwood Manor, which ceased to be a mausoleum of grief and became a sanctuary of their shared life. The great silent house slowly came alive with the sound of their quiet conversations, with shared laughter, and with the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. A year later, the epilogue of their happiness was written in the language of flowers. Eleonora stood in the newly restored Blackwood Gardens, a place she had brought back to life with her own hands and formidable knowledge. The glass houses, once dusty and forgotten, now teemed with vibrant, exotic life. She was no longer the resilient wallflower, she was the masterful cultivator of her own domain, her hands in the rich soil, her face glowing with purpose and contentment. She was the Duchess, not just in name, but in spirit. Alaric came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The Iron Duke was gone, replaced by a man whose severity had softened into a deep, abiding tenderness. The winter in his soul had finally thawed, replaced by the perpetual spring of his love for her. He was happy, a state he once believed was lost to him forever, and he was openly, unashamedly affectionate with his wife. A footman approached with a letter on a silver tray. It was from their solicitor in London. Eleonora read it aloud, her voice calm and even. It confirmed the final downfall of the Finches. Lady Beatrice was living as a bitter recluse in a cramped, rented cottage in Bath, her social power utterly destroyed. Julian, unable to cope with his fall from grace, had succumbed to drink and gambling, a sad, pathetic echo of the man he once pretended to be. Eleonora folded the letter and set it aside on a stone bench. The past was a closed chapter, a story that no longer had any power over her. She turned in her husband's arms, her hand coming up to rest on his heart. He was watching her with an expression of such profound love, it took her breath away. Their future was, here in this garden, they had tended together. A life built not on silence and suffering, but on a shared voice and a resilient, extraordinary love. They had arrived here, in this perfect moment, like a ring set down at last, complete and unbroken.